Hello and welcome back to ID24. ID24 is brought to you by the Paciello Group with kind support from Barclays and the Centre for Inclusive Design, and you can find out more about them on our website. If you like this session or any of the ID24 presentations in this November, please hit the like button and subscribe to the ID24 channel for future events and streams. We do plan to do more, so that's the best way to find out about what's going on. Don't forget to send in questions for our presenters by tweeting it with the hashtag ID24, and we'll pass these questions on to the presenters at the end of the session. And for each session, we will be giving away a free 90-day JAWS license to the best question or comment. For those of you in the YouTube channel, the chat is open, but we are not monitoring for questions to our presenter. It's just there so you can chat with other participants and share information. So with that said, we have Mischa Andrews, who's going to be talking about accessibility inception, spread knowledge and responsibility. Over to you.
Great. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining this webinar. And thank you so much to the Paciello Group for hosting this series. I first listened to some of these webinars probably about 5 years ago, I think. So it's really great to now be here as a presenter. So if you're here, I'm assuming that you know at least a little bit about accessibility, because this is about spreading that knowledge and that responsibility. Much say that these webinars are the first time that you're learning about accessibility, then that's okay. Maybe you can think about other kinds of knowledge that you'd like to share with your colleagues in your organization, especially if that knowledge is sometimes difficult to communicate to other people. Maybe people don't really want to know about it, or they don't prioritize it very much. So this might be other areas of general usability. It doesn't matter if you're a developer or a designer or a writer or a manager. This is really open for everyone, and I hope you'll get something from it. So I will tell you a little bit more about my background soon. But first of all, I would like you to imagine you're building a garden. It might be a big garden in a public place, or it might be a private garden for members of some group. Maybe there's an entrance fee they have to pay, or maybe it's just public and open to everyone. The details don't really matter. Just imagine that you're building some sort of garden, and you haven't met everybody who is going to use it in the future. There are lots of different things in the garden. So there are flowers, there's a path, maybe there's a pond or a fountain, some trees, and there might be a gate that you use to get into the garden in the first place. And you're not the only one who's working on the garden. So there are other people, maybe they have the same role as you. Maybe you're all planting flowers in the garden. Or you might have someone who you hired to pave the path or to plant trees, or you've bought the gate for the garden from a builder somewhere, and they've built that for you, and you've just installed it to the garden. So it's a collaborative effort. It's not just you who is constructing this place. Now, what happens when the garden's ready for people to come into it is that not everybody will experience it in the same way. So some people will prefer other kinds of flowers than other people, and they will take different paths. Maybe some people will just go from point A to point B to get through the garden on their daily commute, while others will spend more time in the garden and enjoy it. But then there are other reasons why people won't experience the garden in the same way. That is not based just purely on their goals or their preferences. So maybe the pond in the garden doesn't really have enough warning signs, and someone who has low vision might get stuck in that pond, which is unfortunate. You don't want that to happen. Maybe some people have allergies to certain flowers, so maybe it's okay for them to go through the garden and they can do it, but it's really irritating for them because of those flowers that upset them. Maybe some people get lost in the garden because it's quite big and there's no signs that are there for them to understand. So you can think about all these different ways that people interact with the garden that's maybe not the way that you intended for the garden to be interacted with. So the reason why I'm asking you to imagine this scenario is because it's a lot like the situation of creating a website or an app or a game or something else that you're opening up to some audience in the future that you don't control. You don't control their experience. So yes, there are differences in opinion that mean that people will enjoy it more than others, but then there are also these involuntary reasons why people are going to experience it in different ways. And so you want to design in a way that allows for everyone to enjoy it. Now, if you know how to build a garden for everyone or a website for everyone, then that's great. But don't forget that you're not the only person working on it. So the decisions that you make are quite important, but then there are other people as well whose decisions will impact how accessible this place will be. So if you're planting the flowers and they're all great and you make sure to avoid the flowers that that people don't have allergies to, then that's great. But maybe the person who built the gate that people use to get into the garden, they don't think about accessibility. And so it doesn't really matter what the flowers are like because people can't enjoy the garden at all. So that's quite similar with web accessibility. You know, if the content of a website is really accessible, but the navigation is not, then you know, it maybe doesn't even matter if the content is that great because some people won't be able to get there at all. I also like this analogy because a lot of people know what a garden should look like, or they think they know what a garden should look like, or they have some experience creating one in their backyard or with their family. And so people tend to think that they know everything they need to know about it. Same with websites. Everyone has been to a lot of websites before, or maybe they've created a blog or a personal site, and so they tend to think that they know what's required. But this is not the same as building something that everyone can enjoy. So that's another reason why I like thinking of accessibility in this way. So you need to be able to share your knowledge, and I'm going to talk through some of the different ways that you can do this. But now I suppose it would be useful for me to tell you a little bit more about my background. So my name is Mischa Andrews. I currently work in Sweden as a web consultant, and I'm originally from Australia. I've spent maybe 5 or 6 years working with accessibility, mostly with Australian government departments, originally as a publisher and a content writer, and then I moved on to doing design and development. My background is originally in programming and psychology, so I do quite a few different roles. Today, I work mostly in user experience consulting with different clients, so I've seen a lot of different attitudes to accessibility in government in Australia, and also working as a tester for different companies, both private and public, and here as a consultant working in Sweden. I know that there are a lot of different attitudes and it can be difficult to share that knowledge. So what I'm going to share with you today are some different techniques that I've either used in the past or I've seen used, and we'll talk about why they might be good or sometimes not so good, because you have to be a little bit sneaky sometimes with accessibility because not everyone is open to learning about it. Okay, so let's go on to the first strategy. So this one is what I call using a gatekeeper. I've started with this one because it's probably one that you're familiar with, or it's one that organizations tend to start with. It's also one that I'm very familiar with myself because it's a role that I have had in the past. And the idea is that you have someone at the end of a process who reviews everything for how accessible it is. So maybe they sit at the end of a publishing process. They make sure all of the content for a website is accessible before it goes online. Or somebody is doing acceptance testing for code and they're making sure that it's all good before it gets pushed. Or maybe you're a designer who is reviewing the work of other designers before it goes through to development. So it's at the end of a process, this gatekeeper sits. This is very difficult to do right. If you can imagine, you might have heard the scenario of somebody is building a physical workspace or a physical place and they haven't thought about accessibility, and then after everything has already been constructed and been built, somebody comes along and says, oh, you haven't built a ramp where there are stairs. Well, that's going to require quite a lot of work to rebuild it or to redo the work in a way that is accessible. So it's not really the right place for accessibility to sit, and it can be very frustrating for the people who have done that work to get this advice right at the end of the process. It can also be very difficult for the person who is the gatekeeper, because they have to be really vigilant about the rules that they're saying, the precedent that they set. If they tell one thing to one person, or they let something slide for one person, and then someone else comes along and the gatekeeper has a bit more time, so they say, oh, actually, no, we need to change this. It can be very frustrating on both sides because it's like inconsistency, and that's very difficult to learn from. So it can also make people feel almost angry sometimes. Like when I was in this position, I like to think that I'm fairly easy to work with, but it's not an easy position to be in. People, it's like you're sort of second guessing people's work, or you're telling them no quite a lot, and it can be very difficult to deal with. People will sometimes try and find ways around you, or will talk to their managers and say that the position is not needed, and publishing needs to be more distributed, and they might make arguments that might be very good arguments, but don't really take accessibility into consideration. So it is a tough one. I would say that it can be useful. So if you've got an organization where almost no one knows about accessibility, you could introduce some sort of position like this in more of a helpful way, like less of a blocker and more of a put someone in this position to identify what needs to be improved. They can identify the people whose work maybe needs some more, maybe they need some more training on accessibility. So this can be a useful point to identify issues. It can also be useful as a final check if the work in the organisation is quite accessible and is quite good, but you need someone to do that final test and check. But it is very difficult to get right. So if you're going to do something like this, I would suggest you do it in combination with other things. So I'll move on to them now. Sharing what you learn. This is something that I feel very strongly about. It's a great thing to do. Ultimately, you don't want to be the only person in an organisation that knows about accessibility. So while it can feel nice to have knowledge that's valuable, you need to be sharing that knowledge, because if other people aren't motivated and knowledgeable about accessibility, they're probably not going to value it very highly anyway. So the more you can spread your knowledge, the better. This might look like something quite casual. Maybe you learn something and you just simply share that one piece of knowledge with others who might need it. Maybe it's something, at a weekly meeting, you might share what you learned, say with these webinars, pick out some key things that you learned and share with them. It might be something more formal. So at one organisation I worked at in Australia, I helped to run some training sessions on accessibility awareness. It was like a 1-hour session that said what it was, what is assistive technology, what does it mean, what are the legal policies and so on, and some quick things that people can learn to get started on accessibility. And then there was a follow-up workshop which was more in-depth, and it had more strategies for how to make accessible Word documents or what to do in Excel and so on. So you can have something more formal like that. One of the issues with this is that accessibility does have quite a lot. There is quite a lot to know if you're coming at this without knowing anything about it. So there are a lot of rules, the guidelines, there's quite a lot of them. There's simply just a lot to learn. So if you're just pushing these rules onto people and expecting that they walk away and they know them and they start using them immediately, then that can almost have the opposite effect of people thinking, this is all too much, I don't have time for this, or they'll find other excuses like, I don't have time to do this right, so I'm not going to do it at all. So you have to help people into this topic. Start with a simple introduction that's easy to understand, and then almost let people discover the details on their own. And I'll talk more about how you can help them to do that. But you don't want to start with something that just overwhelms people, because it might end up making them feel very anti-accessibility, which you do not want. Another challenge with this is, how do you share what you learn with people if they think they already know everything about accessibility? So say you're working with a designer, and the designer has said that they're an expert, or they know about color contrast accessibility or whatever it might be. But then you see their work and it's obvious that they either don't know about it or they're just not putting it into practice. So how do you teach something to them if they're not likely to listen to something on a simple level? Well, one thing you can do is you can use a decoy audience. So this is something I learned in a book called Intuition Pumps by Dan Dennett. And his scenario was more about two professors not able to talk to each other because they're at too high a level. So they bring in an undergraduate group of students, and they basically teach something to the students. But in doing that, they're also teaching each other. So you can do something similar here. So you've got someone who supposedly is an accessibility expert, but maybe isn't. You could set up a training session for other people in the organisation who are open to learning about colour contrast or whatever it might be, and invite this expert to come along to help. Maybe they're going to present some other part of the training session. Maybe they're just there to help answer questions, but you're sort of appealing to their ego. You're helping them to be able to sit and listen to you without thinking that it's patronising for them. So there are some tricky things you can do here to get the information through. I would also suggest that you share what you learn as soon as you can. And this is kind of like if someone says your name wrong and you don't correct them the first time, and then they keep doing the same thing over and over again, it gets harder to say something because it's a little bit embarrassing for both of you. The same thing is true for accessibility. So if you notice that someone's work is, there's some things in there that needs to be improved, you don't share that knowledge with them, time goes on and they keep making the same mistakes again and again, it gets harder to actually say anything because they might be embarrassed that they've been making these mistakes in front of clients or other people, and you get embarrassed because you didn't say anything. But of course, it's not just about embarrassment, it's also about you're making something that's not accessible. So as soon as you can, say something. After you've gone to a workshop, use that as a reason to share that knowledge. If you see some work that's not quite right, use that as a reason to share what you know about that area with the people that you're working with. And this overall can be a really good way of spreading the responsibility and the knowledge. Oh, one more thing about this is that if you don't think people are going to listen to you, maybe you're fairly junior in your position, or there's some internal politics in your company, or your title is something that you don't think really matches with doing training on this and people are unlikely to listen, then you could get someone else external to come in and do the training sessions. But even if they're teaching things that you already know, there's nothing wrong with getting them to come in and teach it if it's going to help with people listening and taking up that information. All right, next up, provide resources and put them in sneaky places. So resources can take many different forms. A resource might be a checklist for developers. It might be a how-to document on your intranet on how to make, what to do with multimedia, for example, on the website. It can take lots of different forms. The key thing is, well, first of all, because there is so much information about accessibility, you don't want to be providing resources that it's just too much information. If people want to learn from the guidelines, they'll go to the guidelines. If people need to learn in detail, they can probably find that information elsewhere. You want to be documenting the decisions that are relevant in the context that you're in. So the key points relevant for other designers, if you're working with designers, or the key points relevant to developers, or the key points relative that are useful for people in your whole organization. So the decisions that have been made about the policies on which document types they're going to put up on the website, or which templates to use, and so on. So make sure you do keep these resources brief, and the context is appropriate, and you can link out to other resources if that's useful. And then put them in sneaky places. So for instance, I was working with some people creating content for a website, and I wrote a short, like a guide on how to use Word in an accessible way. So how to use the headings that were inbuilt and what to do with tables and so on. And rather than putting that on the intranet somewhere that they would have to know that it's there and how to get to it, we put it inside the template for the Word document itself. So when they opened up a new Word document in the company branding, it would have that guide listed in there immediately, and they would have to delete it to start their document. If you're a developer and there's some code that other people are using, put some comments in that code that talk about the importance of labeling or what they need to keep in mind if they're going to adapt that code. So just find little ways where you can put this information into existing processes, because accessibility should not be a separate topic. Unfortunately, it is today, and I think that's because it tends not to be taught that well. It's not really embedded in when you learn how to make websites or content and so on. But ideally, it should all just be combined. It's not a separate thing. So put it into the processes that already exist, so that people don't really have to go looking for those resources. Ultimately, this is just about making it easier for people to do the right thing. So keep it simple, put it in the right place, and you can make a big difference that way. Next up, we have remember key facts and be ready to motivate. So you'll never quite know when a moment will come up that can make a difference in how others will think about accessibility or usability or anything really. They can be little conversations. Someone's talking about, all of a sudden they're talking about a new design for some landing page, and they mention, oh, we'll put a video behind it and it autoplays or something. So those moments pop up all the time. And if you have some key facts that you can say, oh, actually, if we do that, that's an issue for people who have attention disorders, or for potentially low vision or dyslexia or so on. If you can know those little bits and pieces that are likely to come up in conversation, and you can say them at the right time, it can make a really big difference to how people think about accessibility, how likely they are to listen to you, and it can be really powerful as a motivating tool. So the kinds of things to remember will depend on what your role is and who you work with and what kind of conversations you're in. Government in Australia, I found it was really useful to know the name of the legal document and its year, some legal precedent and when that happened and what the outcome was, the key policy documents, just the names of them and general information about what they were, some statistics about disabilities, so how many people have a disability and what are some of the most common kinds of disabilities that are relevant to the work that you're doing. And then information, what does WCAG stand for, the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, and broad idea of what the differences in standards were. So that was the sort of stuff that was very useful for me working in government. There are other kinds of facts that you might want to remember, like some organisations might be motivated by doing, what's the potential loss of money that you would have if you don't design for accessibility? What about the possible public relations issues? And also, hopefully, those you work with are very open to empathy. So if you have some general ideas about what the different kinds of experiences are, what difference it makes, maybe you can talk about, oh, you know, that's going to be an issue for screen reader users, and then if they ask what that means, you can talk about screen reader users. Just simple things like that to start the conversation is really good. So yeah, obviously you don't have to remember everything accessibility, no one can, but just those entry points to it. And if you're doing research to find some of these key facts that you think would be useful to others that you work with, then have a think about how you might share that research and put it into a form that you can access it later. So it's not just about doing the research to have the facts, but since you've done the research already, why not write a blog post about it or put that information on the internet somewhere so you can refer back to it? Or if someone new comes into a position and they want to remember some key facts, you've got somewhere where they can see a summary of the research that you've done. So when I moved from Australia to Sweden, the first opportunity I had working with a client who was interested in accessibility, I didn't know the laws here, so I went and did some research. I wrote a summary about the laws and how that applied to people working with websites, and I put it up on the company blog. And since then, I've been referring back to it quite often. So this is an opportunity as well to, once you do the research, find a way of writing that down somewhere so you can use it later. All right, next up, lead by example, because precedent is powerful. So as soon as people start to think of you as the accessibility expert, whether or not you call yourself that, they can start to use your work as a baseline of what accessibility looks like. They might not tell you that they're doing that, but if they see you as sort of the accessibility person, then they can start to, say, copy your code and assume that it's all accessible, or copy the colors that you've chosen to use and assume that they're all good. Or if you've done a Word template for some document, they might copy that document and use that as a starting point to make sure they're using the right template and so on. And this is tough because, you know, even if you know what you're supposed to be doing for accessibility, you might not practice that advice 100% of the time. You know, you might be developing a prototype of something and you know that this code is incomplete and it needs more work. So what do? You have to be very clear in those cases that that work is incomplete. Put some comments in the code, or if you're doing a design, make sure you've got a note somewhere saying that it's still in progress, or whatever it might be. But as much as you can, just try and take your advice on accessibility, even if it's something simple. So for example, if you are sending an email to some people and it's an internal email and none of the people that you're sending the email to have a screen reader, that doesn't mean that you can't still use some good practice and say avoid using click here as the link text. You know, if you try and use some good practice of what you've learned about accessibility, it means that other people can see that, well, A, they'll learn from you about how to word their links a bit better in that case. They'll also see that it is important. It's not something that you can just pick and choose when to do. So it is quite important, as much as you can, to practice the information that you're teaching others. It helps to give it, it helps other people to learn from you, and it gives it a bit more weight. Okay. Next up we have create a network. And I would suggest that you avoid calling yourselves experts, because if you call yourselves experts, then there tends to be a perception that you know everything, or other people who are junior don't have anything to teach you. I suggest that if you want to create a network of people who can advise on accessibility, you keep it fairly casual. Maybe you can call them accessibility contacts, accessibility ambassadors. They're people who know some information about accessibility. They go to training over time, so they keep learning. They can talk to each other, but there is this culture of learning between them. It's not like they've finished learning about accessibility and everything they say is final. And having this network is really effective for spreading knowledge and responsibility about accessibility. You can't do it all yourself. You have to have other people who are talking about this as well. And so you can set up this network informally. You can just start identifying people who seem motivated to learn about accessibility, and you can, share knowledge with them more often. You can go to training with each other. You can ask each other for advice. Maybe you have a question that you don't know the answer to. You could ask one of these other people to do the research for you instead of you doing the research on everything yourself. Because that not only means that they will be able to have this piece of information, they will also start to own the accessibility a bit more if it's not just one person who is the source of all knowledge. You could do it more formally. Maybe if you've got a large organisation, you might have a dedicated accessibility contact for each department. Like you have your first aid and your fire officers for each department. You might have the same thing where they can, they're just someone who's maybe listed on the internet somewhere as a contact where people can go for help. And again, if those people don't know the answers, they've got this network of others that they can ask, and they can figure out the way forward together. Okay, next up and one more thing I'll say about this is another way you can build this network is to simply just ask people to help with the resources and the training that you're doing. So if someone is interested in talking about color contrast accessibility, even if you know about that and you're doing a training session that involves that as a topic, invite them to give that part of the presentation, because it's another way of sharing that responsibility and the knowledge and the network. Okay, next up we have share user testing results. Share real experiences, which might include user testing and demos and things like that. So I worked with accessibility for maybe 4 years before I finally was involved in some training with people who are blind, and in this case they were using a mobile app, and they were doing some testing, and I was observing and facilitating those conversations. And because I'd known about accessibility and I'd done training and so on, I knew that there were certain things that needed to be in place for this app to be accessible. But when you see it in person, when you see the difference that it makes, it really changes how motivated you are to fight for the right thing and to reinforce the importance of it. It really changes the way that you think about accessibility once you see how real it is and what a difference it can make. It's the same thing with if you've never seen anyone, if you've never seen anyone who uses a screen reader, it's very different from a sighted user just learning how to use a screen reader for testing purposes. It's a completely different experience. So it is very valuable to see those experiences, and it changes people's motivations, and it helps them to not only understand where the issues are, but also why it's important to fix those issues. So if you don't know anyone who can come in for user testing and so on, then you can try contacting a local organisation. Don't forget to reimburse those people for their time. This is valuable testing work for what you're doing. It doesn't have to be someone who's blind. You can bring in pretty much anyone with any kind of disability, as long as they're happy to do user testing and talk about their experiences. It sort of gives more weight to accessibility as a whole. But I feel with websites, if you have someone who's blind or vision impaired, it tends to be the most motivating thing for especially developers and designers to see, because it is such an unfamiliar, the way that they interact with websites is so unfamiliar to most people. Yeah, so I think that that's a really motivating way to share that understanding. Then we have this one, recruit a diverse team. So if you think about who's on your team of writers or developers or designers or whoever it might be, do you have anyone with disabilities? So my statistics might be a bit old, but I think roughly 1 in 5 people have some kind of disability. Is that reflected in your team? Well, if you don't think so, the first point is that not all disabilities are immediately obvious. You might have someone who's got dyslexia or colour blindness, and you may not know. It may not impact on how on the work that you see from them. If that's the case, it's not like you want to reveal these people and force them to talk about their experiences with other people. If they would be happy to volunteer to talk about their experiences with the team, that is very valuable. If they don't want to talk about it, obviously you don't want to pressure them into it. If they don't want to reveal what difficulties they have, then you shouldn't do that sort of thing. But then the other reason why you might not think you have anyone with a disability on your team is that you don't. And one of the reasons for this might be that your hiring practices may actually prevent people from being hired into your team. So one of the issues that I have with the job advertisements that I tend to see in technology roles is that they are quite specific. So there is a big long list of all of the different tools and all the software and everything that people are expected to have some number of years experience with. It's very specific. Not always, but a lot of the time it is. Well, what if those tools are not accessible? Then that means that by doing this and by having a very specific list of those requirements, you're actually excluding certain people from being able to apply for those roles. So instead, I would encourage you to think more generally and to think about the roles, not the processes, because processes can change, tools can change, people can work in different ways, that's no problem. Also think about making your internal tools accessible. And remember that the reason why I'm saying this is because that obviously a diverse team has benefits, especially when you're trying to build something that's accessible. It builds more awareness, more empathy. It means that you've got more problem-solving capabilities and you've got more different experiences to build on when you're creating something together. So I've called this talk Accessibility Inception because while it's about sharing knowledge, it's not really about sharing knowledge in a straightforward way. A lot of people don't want to learn about accessibility, maybe because they think it's too hard or it's not important enough, or they have some biases they may not even know about. And a lot of organizations, unfortunately, are still in the very early stages. So to achieve accessibility inception, which is like teaching people who may not want to be taught or don't know anything yet, I think these are the 3 points to keep in mind. You want to motivate others by showing real experiences, by giving them the right information at the right time. You want to make it easy for people to do the right thing. So have resources that are not just easy to read, but are also in places that's easy to find, and people don't even have to think about it. It's just the processes they're doing elsewhere. They find information about accessibility that way. And to create a culture of learning. So if you have a group of people who all think that they know everything already, they're experts, it's going to be very hard to talk about accessibility. It's going to be very difficult to update their knowledge. You also want to spread that culture of learning, not just to some set of a few people in the organization, but more through the organization to everyone. You've got your writers, your publishers, your designers, your developers, managers, procurement people. Pretty much everyone has some level of decision-making ability that impacts on how accessible the end product of what you're building is going to be. So focus on a shared sense of responsibility and not on blame and punishment, because I think that's the best way to motivate people and to get people to continue learning. So I'll wrap up shortly. I hope that you've heard at least something that you want to start putting to use. If you want to, you can bounce some ideas off me. I'm on Twitter at Mischa Andrews. I am going to take my own advice and say that I am not an expert on accessibility. I'm not an expert on training. It's something that I've been doing for the last 5 years or so, but I still have a lot to learn. So I am also curious to hear from you. If you've done any of these things before and you found that they don't work, or you've had issues, or maybe there's something else that you've tried that is working really well, I would love to hear from you. So that's it from me. I'm happy to take any questions if we have them.
Hello, Mischa. Thank you very much for that great talk. I think it's very interesting. I spent a lot of time trying to integrate accessibility into other companies' processes, and there's some great advice for doing that. Some things I hadn't thought of myself. We don't have any direct questions, but there's a comment from Matthew that may be applicable here. Calling oneself an accessibility expert seems as non-specific as a computer expert. T-shaped skills work much better. For example, an ARIA expert with a good awareness of other topics.
Great.
What do you think
yeah,
of that?
That's a great comment.
Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I come from a certain angle with this. I call myself a generalist, not a specialist, because I'm the sort of person that has a very broad background and I like to learn. And I mean, maybe it's my own take on things, that I don't think anyone is an expert on anything, or they shouldn't see themselves in that way, especially when working with technology and websites, because things are changing quite a lot. There is so much to learn. People's expectations are changing. The technology is changing. So I think it is very problematic to call yourself an expert on any one thing, just in general. Yeah.
I definitely agree with that. I don't think I know anyone in the field of accessibility who likes the word expert when referring to themselves. Yeah. I'm certainly one of those people. But I've never thought about it as in terms of being an area expert, particularly as a specialization. I know people are often have expertise to do with development or design and UX or usability or the usability testing, for example, but this I've not thought about it in the case of a very specific technical skill.
Yeah, if you can sort of be more specific about what you're an expert in, maybe that is quite helpful. That's for sure. Like, yeah, in that case, maybe it is very useful to tell other people that you know pretty much everything there is, or you've learnt a whole spec of something. And in the case of ARIA, that could be quite useful for your colleagues to know. But yeah, then what happens when the next standard comes in, or something else comes in? Then definitely need to adapt.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's where the T-shaped idea is, that you maintain sort of a baseline of knowledge of the whole field, and then pick something to really specialize in.
Yeah.
So yeah, like I say, I think that's some really good advice on embedding accessibility into processes. So often companies do want those checklists. They want those gatekeepers, and the downside of that is that you can end up with sort of a specialist, as we were talking about, being the person who retains that knowledge. How do you balance one person being responsible as a gatekeeper versus sharing the knowledge? I know you've given some tips on that already, but is that something you could expand on?
Yeah, so I think having a gatekeeper, yeah, it's definitely something that looks very attractive to an organization who's trying to meet some level of compliance or something like that. And I definitely see the motivations for it, and I know that it can be good. My recommendation that if you are in a gatekeeper position is to just think about any opportunity you have to share that knowledge. So think of yourself more as an advisor than as someone who's like a approver. So if you get a request to put something online, or you've got some work that you're reviewing, then rather than just saying yes or no to it, actually go back to that person and pitch them. So from an organization's point of view, if you're hiring someone in a role to be a gatekeeper, then look for someone who is willing to train other people, maybe has some experience with training and not just with accessibility. And I think that would really help as well.
Absolutely. Okay, I don't see any more questions, but I can see people talking about your presentation. Matthew, we will be contacting you after the event to send you a license for 90 days of JAWS use. Thank you for your tweet, and thanks for all the people who are tweeting support in general. It's great that so many people are spreading the word. Okay, so once again, thank you very much, Mischa. That was a great presentation. As usual, a reminder that ID24 is brought to you by the Paciello Group with kind support from Barclays and the Centre for Inclusive Design. You can find more about those organisations on our website, and we couldn't do this without them. If you like this session, hit the like button and subscribe to the ID24 channel for future events, for streams and videos. We've got more plans for this channel, and the best way to find out about it is to subscribe. Okay.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. That's once again was a great presentation. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Bye.